Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. Hashtag, the whispers beyond the abyss. The sea had always held a strange allure for Dr. Richard Wallace, a professor of marine archaeology at Miskatonic University. It wasn't the beauty of the ocean that captivated him. Rather, it was the mystery of its depths, the promise of secrets buried beneath miles of crushing water. He had spent decades studying the ancient coastlines of the world, chasing myths and forgotten ruins. But nothing had prepared him for the call he received one bleak November evening. The voice on the other end was that of Captain Elias Ward, an old seafaring man whose ship, the Tempest's Reach, had just returned from a deep-sea expedition near the mouth of Ny'aleth, a region of the ocean notorious for its treacherous waters and unexplained disappearances. Ward spoke in hushed, frantic tones, his words punctuated by the crackle of static. "Professor Wallace, you must come. We found something we weren't meant to find." Ward's voice broke, replaced by the sound of wind howling through the receiver. Before Wallace could respond, the line went dead. He tried calling back, but there was no answer. The urgency in Ward's voice gnawed at him. It wasn't unusual for the captain to exaggerate his findings, but this time, something felt different. There was fear in his voice, and Ward was not a man easily frightened. Wallace packed his bags that night, taking with him only his field journal, a few essential tools, and the amulet he always wore, a relic he had found years ago on a sunken ship, shaped like a twisted star with incomprehensible markings. It was his good luck charm, though lately he had begun to dream strange things when he wore it. The journey to the small coastal town of Innsmouth took a full day. By the time Wallace arrived, the sky was a canvas of dark, churning clouds, and the air smelled of salt and decay. The town was eerily quiet, its narrow streets empty except for the occasional shadow slipping into an alley. He made his way to the docks, where he found the Tempest's Reach moored, its sails tattered and its deck stained with something dark. Captain Ward stood on the pier, staring out at the sea as if transfixed by something only he could see. When Wallace approached, Ward turned, and the professor was struck by the change in the man. His once vibrant blue eyes were sunken and dull, his skin pale and waxy. "Ward," Wallace called out, but the captain did not respond until he was only a few feet away. "You shouldn't have come, Wallace," Ward whispered, his voice barely audible over the crash of waves. "It's already too late." "Too late for what?" Wallace demanded. "What did you find out there?" Ward's eyes darted to the ship, then back to the horizon. "Not here. We'll talk below deck." The stench inside the cabin was unbearable, a mix of rotting fish and something else, something earthy and metallic. Ward poured himself a drink, his hands trembling, spilling more than he managed to swallow. He slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "We were mapping the seabed near Ny'aleth," he began, his voice hollow. Depth readings showed a drop, a trench deeper than anything recorded in that region. We sent down a drone. The feed was clear until we reached the bottom. Wallace leaned in, captivated despite himself. "What did you see?" Ward looked up, and for a moment, Wallace saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, but madness. "There was a temple," Ward whispered. "A structure, massive, ancient, covered in glyphs like nothing I've ever seen. And then the feed cut out. But before it did, before it went black, we saw movement. Something was there, moving inside the temple." Wallace felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He had heard rumors of ruins beneath the waves, tales passed down by sailors and fishermen, but he had never believed them. The ocean had its own myths, its own folklore, and he had always thought them to be just that, stories. "You brought something back, didn't you?" Wallace asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ward nodded, his face ashen. "A piece of the temple. A stone tablet with inscriptions. It's down in the hold. But you shouldn't look at it, Wallace. I shouldn't have brought it here. We've disturbed something ancient, something that was never meant to be found." Despite Ward's warning, Wallace felt an irresistible pull. He made his way to the hold, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. The hold was dark, illuminated only by the dim light of a single lantern. In the center of the room lay a stone tablet, half covered in seaweed, its surface etched with strange, looping glyphs. Wallace's breath caught in his throat as he approached. The markings on the tablet were identical to those on his amulet. His heart pounded as he traced his fingers over the glyphs, feeling a tingling sensation, as if the stone were alive, thrumming with energy. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently. He heard Ward scream above deck, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar, a sound unlike anything Wallace had ever heard, like the wail of 1,000 voices carried on the wind. He stumbled back, the lantern tipping over, plunging the hold into darkness. The glyphs on the tablet began to glow, casting an eerie, bluish light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The shadows around him seemed to shift, taking on strange, unnatural shapes. And then he heard it, a voice. It spoke in a language he couldn't understand, yet he felt the meaning in his very bones. It was a call, an invitation from something far beneath the waves, something ancient and hungry. He bolted back up the stairs, bursting onto the deck. The sea was boiling, churning with waves that rose impossibly high. Ward was on his knees, staring out at the horizon, his lips moving in a silent prayer. "It's coming," Ward said, his voice hoarse. "I can hear it. It's calling for us." Wallace followed his gaze and saw it. A dark shape rising from the depths, its silhouette massive against the stormy sky. It was a form he couldn't fully comprehend, a mass of writhing tendrils and shifting amorphous limbs. The air around it crackled with energy, and the temperature dropped sharply. He realized then that they had not found a ruin. They had found a prison, and they had set something free. The last thing Wallace remembered was the sound of the creature's voice, echoing inside his head. "You are ours now. The abyss has claimed you." Weeks later, the Tempest's Reach was found adrift off the coast of Innsmouth. The crew was missing, and the only trace of them was a single, waterlogged journal belonging to Dr. Wallace. The final entry was almost illegible, scrawled in a trembling hand. "The deep ones have awakened. We were fools to disturb them. Pray that they sleep once more." The journal now resides in the restricted archives of Miskatonic University, sealed away with other forbidden texts. Those who read it report hearing whispers when they are alone, a faint, echoing voice that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They say it's the call of the abyss, still reaching out for its lost children. Hashtag, 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 the song of the drowned god. The village of Blackwater Cove was the kind of place that didn't exist on most maps. Perched on the jagged cliffs of New England, it was shrouded in perpetual fog, a place forgotten by time and seemingly abandoned by the sun itself. Only a few dozen souls lived there, fishermen mostly, their faces as weathered and gray as the sea they feared more than they loved. Dr. Eliza Sterling, a cultural anthropologist from Arkham University, had never heard of Blackwater Cove until she received a peculiar letter, written in a shaky, almost childlike scrawl. The envelope contained no return address, just the single word urgent stamped on the front. Inside, the letter spoke of a strange ritual held by the villagers, an ancient song that was sung once a year on the night of the hunter's moon. The letter was signed by Isaac Carver, a name that seemed oddly familiar. After some digging, Eliza found that Isaac had been a colleague of her mentor, Dr. Harlan White. White had disappeared over a decade ago while researching coastal folklore, his last known whereabouts somewhere near Blackwater Cove. The mention of his name was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Eliza felt a compulsion, a pull she couldn't quite explain, to visit the village. Perhaps it was the connection to her mentor, or perhaps it was the mystery of the letter itself. Either way, within days she found herself on a narrow, winding road, the fog thickening as she drove deeper into the unknown. The first thing Eliza noticed about Blackwater Cove was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you might find in the countryside. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the world was holding its breath. The houses were old, their paint peeling, and the windows boarded up as if to keep something out or in. She parked her car near the edge of the village and made her way to the small inn, the only establishment that seemed open. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman with pale, watery eyes, gave her a tight-lipped smile. "You'll be wanting a room, I reckon," the woman said, her voice raspy. "Yes, and I'm looking for a man named Isaac Carver," Eliza replied, feeling a prickle of unease. The woman's expression darkened. "Isaac? He's gone now, miss. Left us weeks ago, after that incident." "What incident?" Eliza pressed. The innkeeper leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Best not to ask too many questions, miss. There are things here that are better left alone." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. The fog outside seemed to press against her window, swirling like smoke. She kept hearing faint noises, whispers, or perhaps the distant sound of singing carried on the wind. It was a haunting melody, unlike any song she had ever heard, with a rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of her own heart. When morning came, she ventured down to the docks. The sea was unusually calm, its surface like a sheet of polished obsidian. The fishermen glanced at her with wary, sunken eyes, muttering to each other in a language she couldn't understand. It sounded old, like the broken fragments of an ancient tongue. She approached one of the fishermen, an old man with a tangled beard and a face etched with deep lines. "I'm looking for Isaac Carver," she said. "Do you know where I can find him?" The man spat into the water, shaking his head. "Carver's gone, like the rest of him. The sea took him. The song called to him, and he couldn't resist." Eliza frowned. "The song? What song?" The old man gave her a look of pity. "You'll find out soon enough. The hunter's moon rises tonight." As dusk fell, the villagers gathered near the cliffs, forming a silent procession. Eliza followed at a distance, her curiosity outweighing her fear. They moved as one, like shadows in the fog, until they reached the edge of the sea. There, standing on a rocky outcrop, was the largest man she had ever seen, his face hidden beneath a dark hood. He began to chant, his voice deep and resonant, carrying over the waves. It wasn't English, nor any language Eliza recognized. It sounded ancient, primal, like the voice of the earth itself. The villagers joined in, their voices rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic harmony. Eliza felt a shiver of recognition. It was the same melody she had heard the night before, the same rhythm that had haunted her dreams. Her heart raced as she edged closer, trying to understand the words. Suddenly, the hooded man stopped singing, and the villagers fell silent. He lifted his head, and Eliza saw his face for the first time. It was Isaac Carver, but it wasn't the man she remembered from photographs. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide, filled with an unnatural light. He opened his mouth, and Eliza heard a voice that wasn't his own, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. He rises, Carver intoned. The drowned god awakens. The sea began to churn, waves crashing against the cliffs. Eliza stumbled back as a monstrous form rose from the water, its silhouette barely visible in the fog. It was immense, its body covered in scales that glistened in the moonlight, its eyes like black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth like jagged rocks, and let out a sound that was both a roar and a song, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through Eliza's bones. The villagers dropped to their knees, their arms raised in reverence. Eliza watched in horror as they began to crawl towards the water, their bodies moving with jerky, unnatural motions. One by one, they slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the black depths. She turned to run, but Carver's voice stopped her. "You cannot leave," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "The song has chosen you. You belong to him now." Eliza felt her body go rigid, as if invisible hands were pulling her back towards the sea. The song filled her ears, drowning out her own thoughts. She could feel the cold water lapping at her feet, creeping up her legs. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the drowned god's massive, unblinking eye staring into her soul. The next morning, the sea was calm once more. The fog lifted, revealing the empty cliffs. There was no trace of the villagers, no sign of Eliza Sterling. Her car was found abandoned near the docks, her belongings untouched. Weeks later, a fisherman from a nearby town found a piece of driftwood washed up on the shore. Carved into the wood was a single word, written in a shaky hand. "Awaken." The fisherman took it to the local authorities, but they dismissed it as the work of pranksters. Only a few dared to whisper the truth, that the drowned god had risen, and that the people of Blackwater Cove had been claimed by the sea. But on the nights of the hunter's moon, if you listen closely, you can still hear the song, a low, haunting melody carried on the wind, calling out to those who dare to listen. And somewhere, far beneath the waves, the drowned god sleeps once more, waiting for the next chorus. Hashtag the Eldritch Observatory. The Elder Ridge Observatory, perched atop a desolate peak in the White Mountains, was a relic from a forgotten era. Built in the late 1800s by a reclusive astronomer named Aleister Crowell, it was designed to be a place for studying the stars. But the local townspeople whispered that Crow's interests had turned from the heavens above to the dark, unseen spaces between them. By the time of his mysterious disappearance in 1897, the observatory was already considered cursed, a place where the fabric of reality itself had grown thin. For decades, the building had been abandoned, left to rot in the shadow of the mountain. It wasn't until Dr. Edward Blake, a renowned astrophysicist and skeptic, received a cryptic invitation that anyone dared to approach it again. The letter was unsigned, but the elegant script hinted at an author of considerable education. It spoke of a discovery that defies human understanding, promising Blake the answer to the greatest mysteries of the cosmos. Blake, a man driven by curiosity and a need to debunk the supernatural, decided he would investigate. He gathered a small team. His assistant, Margaret Lacey, a brilliant mathematician, and Professor Samuel Reed, an expert in ancient texts and languages. Together, they set off for the observatory, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. The journey to Elder Ridge was treacherous, the narrow road twisting through dense, fog-laden forests. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, night had fallen, and a thin veil of mist clung to the ground. The observatory loomed above them, its silhouette stark against the dark sky, like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast. Blake felt an unease he couldn't quite place, but he pushed it aside, leading the way up the winding path to the entrance. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty halls, and they stepped inside. The air was stale and cold, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The interior was surprisingly intact. Old maps of the night sky were pinned to the walls, and books lay open on tables, their pages yellowed with age. In the center of the room was the telescope, a massive, archaic instrument pointed skyward through the shattered glass dome. Margaret ran her hand over the polished metal, a look of awe on her face. "This equipment is over 100 years old," she whispered. "It shouldn't even be functional." Blake nodded, but his attention was drawn to a large, leather-bound journal lying open on a nearby desk. He picked it up, skimming through the pages. It was filled with Crow's notes, written in a frenzied, erratic script. The entries started with mundane observations of the stars, but quickly devolved into ramblings about the unseen watchers and the call from beyond the void. What did he find here? Blake muttered to himself, flipping through the journal until a single word, scrawled in bold, jagged letters, caught his eye. Ny'aleth. Blake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had come across the name before, buried deep in ancient texts and occult lore. Ny'aleth was said to be an ancient cosmic entity, a messenger of the outer gods, known to drive those who encountered it to madness. "Take a look at this," he said, handing the journal to Reed, who paled as he read the name. This can't be real," Reed stammered. "It's a myth, a legend. Crow must have lost his mind." But Margaret was already at the telescope, adjusting the lenses. "You need to see this," she called out, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. Blake hesitated, then stepped up to the eyepiece. As he looked through, the world around him seemed to fall away. The night sky was clear, the stars burning brighter than he had ever seen. But there was something else, a dark patch, a void, where no stars shone. It was as if a piece of the sky had been torn away, leaving only a gaping blackness. "What is that?" Blake asked, stepping back, his heart pounding. "It's not a star," Margaret said quietly. "It's a shadow or a portal." The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep along the floor, spreading outwards from the telescope. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp like blood. Reed flipped through the journal frantically. Crow described this, he said, his voice trembling. He called it the Eye of Ny'aleth. "It's not a star, it's a gateway." He believed it was a way for something to look back at us. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, droning hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Blake turned to the telescope, his breath visible in the freezing air. The eyepiece glowed with a faint, blue light, and the shadows in the room began to shift, taking on strange, writhing shapes. Margaret backed away, her eyes wide with terror. "It's looking at us," she whispered. "Whatever it is, it knows we're here." Blake grabbed the journal, frantically reading the final entries. Crow had described a ritual, a method of contacting the entity beyond the void. But the last page was smeared with ink, as if the pen had been dragged across the paper in a sudden, violent motion. The final words were barely legible. "The shadow has entered. It wears many forms. It is among us now." The lights in the observatory flickered, then went out completely. They were plunged into darkness, the only sound the steady hum that had now risen to a deafening pitch. The shadows around them coalesced, forming a tall, humanoid figure. It was featureless, its body a swirling mass of darkness, and where its face should have been was only a gaping void. Reed screamed, clutching his head as if in agony. "It's inside my mind," he shrieked, collapsing to the floor. Blake and Margaret stumbled back, but the figure moved towards them, its presence overwhelming, like the weight of 1,000 galaxies pressing down on their souls. It raised a hand, or what could be called a hand, and Blake felt a pressure against his chest like an invisible vice squeezing his heart. "You have seen beyond the veil," a voice whispered, echoing inside his skull. It was not a human voice. It was a sound like the grinding of distant stars, the roar of the cosmic void. Margaret fell to her knees, her eyes wide and unblinking. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice monotone. "The pattern, the order beneath the chaos. I can see it now." Blake reached out to her, but his hand passed through empty air. Margaret was gone, dissolved into the darkness as if she had never been there. The figure stepped closer, the void where its face should be staring into Blake's eyes. He felt his sanity unraveling, the boundaries of his mind shattering like glass. He saw visions, endless, writhing masses of tentacles, cities built of impossible geometry, and a vast, shifting entity that loomed over everything, its many eyes staring directly at him. The last thing he heard was its voice, a soft, almost mocking whisper. "You sought the truth. Now you are part of it." The observatory was found abandoned weeks later. There was no sign of Blake, Margaret, or Reed. Only the journal remained, its pages soaked with ink that seemed to shift and change when looked at directly. It was taken to the restricted archives of Miskatonic University, where it sits locked away, unread. But on clear nights, when the stars align just right, people claim they can hear a low, droning hum coming from the direction of Elder Ridge, a sound that vibrates through the bones and fills the mind with strange, incomprehensible visions. And those who look through the telescope, if only for a moment, say they see the eye staring back at them, watching, waiting,